Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ellis, let me begin with you regarding S872 and the land lists. You have indicated that the administration opposes this legislation, but that you are willing to work with us, which I appreciate. Also appreciate the willingness to work with us on some of the existing eligible communities that don't have administrative remedies, so we got some work to do there. You do indicate in your written testimony that you seem to be concerned that given what we're doing with processing the conveyances owed to Alaska Natives and the state of Alaska under several federal acts, you know, we've got a lot yet to do. Believe me, I know how much we have to do because it was my 2004 legislation that tried to speed this up, and we're not moving at a rate that I would like, but I'm concerned that you would think that with the limited conveyances that we're talking about here, that somehow or other this derails your process. It would add, I don't disagree, but I can't believe that it is going to considerably delay. The question that I want to ask you specifically is your concern that somehow or other allowing for the 5 landless communities somehow or other risks a precedent, and you use the words, it would create a continual land transfer cycle in Alaska. I don't understand this because you acknowledge that it's only Southeast communities that were denied an appeals process to challenge corporation authorization decisions. And there are no other communities in Southeast in 1970 that were considered for inclusion in the claim settlement. So I just don't see possibly how passage of a bill like this could possibly set a precedent for other Native towns to seek to reopen status determinations. So how do you think that this somehow risks a precedent, or that it is a continual land transfer cycle?
Madam Chair, thank you for the question. In the first part of your comment, as far as the time frame, really for our BLM people in Alaska, these would be the same people that would be working on both sets.
Right, understand.
More people, so that it would mean that they would have to focus time on this. And so, you know, this.
David, I will just say that the land lists in Southeast have been waiting some 44 years, so they would like to get in the queue.
We feel that the best way, this Anchorage National Native Claims Settlement Act, you're aware, it was all-encompassing. It's all-encompassing. And in completing it is the best way to be fair. These 5 communities, it's my understanding, they did go through, 3 of them, I guess, went through an appeal process that they were turned down in that appeal. Congress did not originally include these 5 communities. My experience also in my career has been, you know, there are always other people looking over the fence, right? They're always looking at what you're doing. And we are concerned about opening this issue back up without bringing this other piece to closure.
Well, you haven't answered the question about somehow or other this being precedent setting, and that you're now going to open this up so that you have more asks, if you will. Let me address a concern that Mr. Lindekugel raised, and that is that somehow or other this bill would result in our parks, our monuments, other congressionally protected lands being given to our Native peoples. It's my understanding, what will happen here is the Secretary would ultimately make the decision as to what lands to offer these new Native corporations, and not within the, not in the back door or the back room in some kind of secret consultation. But I think it begs the question why the Secretary would pick parks or monuments or any kind of protected lands to convey to new corporations when there's more than 10 million acres in the national forest that lie outside of any conservation units. So it seems that the fear and I think it's an unmerited, unjustified fear that somehow or other, if we allow these five communities that were left out, access to lands, that somehow or other it's going to come from protected areas, and it will again open up this continuing ask for additional claims. It seems to me that the arguments that are being made are somewhat specious, and I'm trying to determine whether or not the administration actually feels that the Secretary would make available lands that are in protected status when there is no reason to. Can you lay at rest that concern?
I would, Madam Chairman, I'd prefer not to speculate on these areas on the Forest Service, on the Tongass National Forest. I would defer to the Forest Service on that.
But I think that we can agree that there is considerable land, more than 10 million acres, that lie outside of any conservation units. So for the suggestion to be made that somehow or other, if you give this land to these five communities to allow for possible development, that somehow or other we're snatching it out of parks or conservation units, I think it is wrong to suggest that. Mr. Barlow, I wanted to ask you about the issues as they relate to the benefits, because it has been suggested here in testimony today that the natives in the five communities have received their benefit because you are considered at-large members of the Sea-Alaska Regional Corporation. And to use the words from Mr. Lindekugel, he says you have already received adequate compensation. Can you speak to that? And you suggested that there is cultural benefit to owning your land, the value of native land ownership. I mentioned in my remarks that there's also financial remuneration that leads to benefit differences. But can you just speak to whether or not, coming from the Wrangell community, whether there is a concern as to whether or not there has been a level of equity or fairness in terms of what the other communities have been able to receive and the landless communities have not been the beneficiary of?
Thank you, Madam Chair, for the question. Certainly, we have not been on par with those that did achieve a settlement and have been granted lands. Those corporations have been able to engage in business practices. They've developed an economic generator to preserve, in some cases, to produce significant economic benefits to their shareholders that we can't because we don't have a land base to work with. Some of the things they've done besides enter into everyday business operations are engaged in things like cultural tourism, ecotourism. They've developed several benefit programs for their shareholders, such as scholarships, in some cases burial assistance, and have been able to provide additional dividends from their village corporation that we don't derive. And those benefits are in addition to what Sea-Alaska Corporation does provide them as Sea-Alaska shareholders. So we have been handicapped and literally denied 44 years of opportunity that others have been able to take advantage of. So that's why we feel this is an inequity and it needs to be adjusted.
Well, I thank you for that. Mr. Lindekugel, let me ask you, you've stated very clearly that you recognize the cultural benefit and that you, and I don't want to put words in your mouth. I'm kind of looking at the notes that I wrote down as you were speaking, but that you recognize the benefit to the Native people of these five communities in trying to find some level of equity here. But you've also suggested in your testimony that this bill would create land inequities where none currently exist. What I'm trying to figure out is how a statement like that can be made when we have some 3,500 natives within the Southeast region that did not gain any surface estate through the creation of an urban or a village corporation. And the other native villages, similarly situated in neighboring towns and villages, were able to receive this benefit. We've just heard Mr. Barlow say that there is a distinction. It seems to me that's where the inequity is. It is not in allowing for these 5 that were kept out of the original agreements. It seems that the only way to make it equitable is to allow for them to have that same access to benefit, which is their land, as the other villages and towns were able to when the act first came into being. So I'm trying to understand why you are saying that this bill would create inequities where none currently exist. It seems to me we definitely have an inequity here, and it's represented in these five communities, and we're trying to correct that. Can you clarify what you intended?
I'll try, Madam Chair.
Yeah.
That isn't based on my analysis. That was based on analysis from the Department of Interior in 1997 when they submitted information to your father, Senator Murkowski, relating to an earlier version of this bill, and it was one of the concerns that they raised, and we think it needs to be addressed in this process as well. They are landowners.
Who are?
The landless do have a beneficial interest in Sealaska Corporation's lands. So,
But there's a difference, we agree, between the surface and the subsurface, and this is where the landless have not been able to access that benefit.
well, Sealaska also has surface lands, as you know from last year's bill.
Certainly.
The contentious there, but and this doesn't change the subsurface issue. Sealaska would get the subsurface for all the lands that these communities would ultimately get. So, that doesn't, our fundamental concern is maintaining the integrity of the Tongass. And I appreciate your intent not to include lands that are been recognized and protected as in the national interest. However, deferring to a Secretary of Interior some later point to make good decisions is a concern to us. We remember conservation interests, remember Secretary James Watt and some of the proposals he made in the early 80s that were of great concern to conservation interests about protected lands and their continued protection. So the idea that a Secretary of Interior would not take action that would be inconsistent with protecting these lands is...
I guess the question that is bottom line for me is making sure that those who were effectively disenfranchised, these 5 communities, that there is some way that we can provide for equity to them. That's what I'm seeking to do. So do you, recognizing that you're speaking for SEAC here, does SEAC oppose giving any land to capitalize these five communities?
We do not believe that giving lands to for-profit corporations, whether they're native or non-native, from the Tongass is in the best interest of the region and the existing sectors of the economy that depend upon those resources.
When Juneau and Sitka were able to receive this benefit, you didn't think that they should receive it either?
We were not involved in that decision.
Well, and this is where I'm trying to get. You have a limited number of communities in Southeast, all there in the Tongass. For whatever reason, you had five of them that all, with the exception of Teneke, met the criteria in terms of native, non-native composition, the other criteria that were there, and they were excluded. And 44 years later, we're trying to figure out how we make sure that they are not left out. And I think it's really difficult to argue that we cannot touch the Tongass. We have to keep the Tongass intact. These are the people who have been living in the Tongass, raising their families in the Tongass, educating their children in the Tongass for time immemorial. And so when I think about keeping the Tongass intact, I also remember the people of the Tongass and making sure that they have that access and that claim to their lands, their cultural heritage lands. And so I get a little passionate about this because I go to Wrangell and I see Lovey, and Lovey tells me, Lisa, you better not forget the landless. And I go to Haines and I hear it in Ketchikan and I hear it in Petersburg. Why were we left out? And then when I hear from organizations such as SEAC that says, by gosh, we got to keep the Tongass intact. We cannot let the people have their land. That really disturbs me. Why it should be okay for some within the region that, well, we missed the boat on that. We weren't there early enough to object to it. And this was the same battle that we fought with the Sea-Alaska Lands Bill. Do you support the legislation that Senator Sullivan and I have introduced that would allow for our Native veterans to receive their allotments? Is that something that SEAC is supportive of? You did
Madam Chair,
on that one.
I'm not aware of the specifics of that legislation. I understood that that was addressed during the Clinton administration back in 1998 with your father and Congressman Young, so I'm not certain of the issues involved or the proposed solutions to those. So we haven't.
Well, it's an interesting issue because we have a situation again where the Southeast Alaska residents were treated differently than natives in other parts of the state. I'm going to be asking the department for their suggestions as to how do we address that. But effectively, it's going to be the same situation. What we're going to be seeking to do is to provide for a level of equity for our native veterans, and that equity will be in the form of land. And so if again SEAC comes back and says, well, we don't think our Alaska Native veterans should be able to receive from the Tongass because we want to keep the Tongass intact, we've just gone round and round in circles here. We must be working together, and you suggest that we need to engage in public dialogue, and I would welcome that. I know that the people of these 5 communities have been engaged in very public, very open dialogue because I've been the beneficiary of much of that. So we need to find some resolve. And 40 years is a long time. We waited a long time with the Sea-Alaska bill, and I want to make sure that other residents in Southeast, whether they be veterans or individuals in our 5 landless communities, have the equity that they've been seeking for so long.